Good morning. Welcome to the session about API first. So my name is Leers. I work in the office of the CTO at Acquia. So working directly with Dries to work on the things that he feels are very important. And one of those is the API First initiative. And I do that mostly together with Matteo, who lives in sunny Mallorca in comparison to very gray and rainy Belgium today. But unfortunately, he's not going to be able to be here today. So you'll have to do it with just me. So the things we'll cover, the goal of the session is to have an open discussion at the end, but I want to make sure that everybody is on the same page, everybody knows what's been going on with the API First initiative, where we are at, what next steps are, and so on. But really, I want to get feedback from all of you, concerns, complaints, frustrations, successes, all of it. So gonna go through it. But first, I have a very small quick questionnaire for all of you. So raise your hand if you've worked on a decoupled project at all, at any time. Okay, so that's probably about a third, and I'm going to try to keep notes of that, so I do have a sense of that. So 30%. Who of you has done this more than a year ago? Like last time you touched it was more than a year ago. Wow. 6 or 7 hands. So that's very little. More than 6 months ago? Nobody. Right now? Or there was one person over there. Right now? Or in the last 6 months? Again, about a fourth. Okay. So one person, 1 in 4. Was it critical to the overall project? Like, was the decoupled aspect of it crucial to the nature of the project, or was it kind of an edge case thing? Critical? Yes? Okay, so just about everybody who's worked on it, I guess, or a fifth. If you haven't yet worked on a decoupled project, so with decoupled Drupal, would you like to do so in the future? As in, who would like to get a chance to play with it? Who is excited about it, or slightly excited about it? Okay, so that's about a third. Have you used the core REST module? If you have used it, have you used the core REST module or something else? So REST, about a fifth again. If you've been using that, have you also been using the contrib REST UI module to configure it? That's basically half of those people. Did it noticeably improve in the last year or so, the core REST module, if you've been using it for a while? Did you notice improvements? I see some nodding, but I guess most people haven't been using it for that long time, such a long time consistently. Json Api, who has used Json Api? About a fifth again. GraphQL. Who has used GraphQL? 3 people. Okay. And who of you has used a combination of all of the above, or like a mishmash? Okay, like 1 in 10 or so. All right, thank you. So I've got some sense now. It seems like most of you have had some experience or would like to find out. So that means that you will be learning quite a few things, hopefully, in this session. So the vision, what are we wanting to achieve with API First? So this is a statement that Dries made. He believes it's important to have first-class web services. So first-class meaning it is a primary thing. It is something that you strive towards first. So important to have first-class web services in Drupal, out of the box, so standard with Drupal, to enable top-notch APIs, so not just APIs that you can use, but actually ones that are pleasant to use, that have a good developer experience and so on. And because of all that, continue our evolution to become API first. So API first versus not means APIs being added later, means your API second or third or fifth, because it's an afterthought. API first means you first build the API and then build everything else on top of it, UIs, features, and so on. So that is kind of the goal. And if we translate that into something somewhat concrete or in terms of capabilities, then this is what it kind of would look like. The goal is to have an unparalleled API-first platform, which means that all data that is stored and managed in Drupal would be available both RESTfully and non-RESTfully. RESTfully in any format, so currently Drupal core supports JSON, XML, JSON, but also in multiple flavors. So currently the core REST module only supports HTTP purist mode, if you will, but there are other flavors that are more opinionated, such as JSON API. So that's RESTful, but then on the non-RESTful side of things, so when you're not basing it strongly on HTTP verbs, GraphQL is another way to interact with data that is in a non-RESTful way. Or another interesting one that is perhaps less often heard of is the CouchDB protocol. So CouchDB protocol is something that you can use for replication between different sites or different instances. And also because of that, you can use it for syncing it to a client. So for example, to do offline first applications. And the goal is to have all of this, RESTful or non-RESTful, whichever one, to have it all available using whichever authentication mechanism you would like. So this is the goal for Drupal, to provide all of this so you can use the tools you would like, the mechanisms you would like, the things you prefer, and just get the data in and out of Drupal using whichever mechanism you like or are familiar with. And increasingly we are seeing that people not just want this, but need this. In the last year or so, the number of sessions about this topic has been exploding. So Dublin Baltimore, for example, 12 sessions. Just a few weeks ago, there was a special event specifically about decoupled Drupal, decoupled dev days in New York City. And so it seems like more and more that is being confirmed, that vision. So goals. If we translate the vision into concrete goals, then these are kind of the things that have been outlined as part of the API First initiative as must-have, should-have, and could-have. So must-have is a thing that we will definitely be working on a lot, and then gradually going down, of course. So Drupal 8 shipped with core REST, and it shipped with it, but it wasn't very usable. So the first goal was to make it actually usable. But we want to go further. We want to have it to be top-notch. So best in class is the next step, and having excellent documentation, automatically generated documentation, so that when you configure your entity types and you set up your content types, that you actually get automatically the documentation with interactive examples, so that you can see what it's like to interact with that data via REST APIs. We've made good progress. The usable bit is done. We are working very hard on the best in class and are making good progress there as well. And the documentation via OpenAPI is also proceeding very well. Should have. We would like to see JSON API in Drupal core. It is more opinionated. It offers more features. It is more limited in other ways. I'll talk about that more later. But in any case, it's something that we should have. GraphQL is very much rising in popularity. It's also something we should have. And the Workflows initiative is something that's been going on in Drupal as well. And just 2 days ago, I think, the Workflows module in Drupal 8 core for Drupal 8.4 has been marked as stable. So Drupal 8.4.0 will ship with a stable Workflows module. Then you still need the content moderation module on top of that, but that is, it sounds like it's pretty likely that that will ship as stable as well with 8.4. So you want to be able to do workflow things via REST APIs as well. And so to do that, we need support for revisions, which we don't currently have in REST or JSON API. And we also need to make it about UUIDs, because you could have two content editors on separate sites be creating the same or very different content. They get the same node ID, for example, and then it's a clash. How do you solve that? Well, through UUIDs. Progress there. JSON API has a stable release as of a few months ago, and it's going forward still in terms of maturing. GraphQL is approaching a stable release. It's going to get a stable release in the next few weeks, probably. And so good progress there as well. In terms of could-haves, OAuth 2 support. Currently, Drupal core only supports cookie authentication, which is definitely not ideal, not quite secure. We have basic authentication, basic HTTP authentication, which is it's better, but it's also not the mechanism that most people prefer, and it is less secure than OAuth 2, so OAuth 2 is something that we would like to see. CouchDB support is something that would be very beneficial for offline first applications, which are likely to increase in in demand in the coming months and years. But for now, that doesn't seem to get a lot of traction. So we are focusing a lot of things at the same time, obviously. So OAuth 2 support is a thing that is moving forward actively. So as you can see, most of these high-level goals are actively moving forward. If you compare that to 6 months ago when we last did a talk like this, you can see that there was just one green checkbox, one green checkmark, and just some progress. And now we have Json API also complete, and we are working on OAuth 2, which wasn't happening before. Open API documentation is moving forward really well, so we are making good progress. You may wonder why each of these things, why did we pick those, and what is actually still going on there. So these are the 4 things that I think would appeal to the broadest of audiences, so I'll go a bit deeper in on those 4. The REST API is something that needs to mature. JSON API is stable in 8.3 contrib. Now in 8.4, which is going to be released in a few weeks' time, it needs to mature further, and then hopefully for 8.5 it could actually live in Drupal core, which would mean that it's available to everyone all the time. It's not sure we will make it for 8.5, but if not, then it will be very, very solid for 8.5, and then it will be moved into 8.6. GraphQL, it doesn't have a stable release yet, but it is going to get one in a few weeks' time, hopefully. So it will be stable for 8.4 contrib and then mature in 8.4 contrib, and we'll see how that moves forward. And then finally, documentation, automatically generated documentation for the APIs that Drupal provides. That's also very important, and we're trying to get towards a stable release in Drupal contrib in 8.4, so that's coming as well. So why each of these? For REST API, the reason that it's different from JSON API, for example, is that it does support multiple formats. So instead of JSON API, which is a JSON API, but then a very opinionated one, so it's always returning JSON, not XML, not something else. You cannot really create new flavors or new normalizations of JSON API because it prescribes very specifically how it's supposed to work. If you do have that need, for example, if you are tying into some external system and you need to provide a very specific formatted response, that's when REST API is something that you can use and JSON API is something you can't. REST API supports anything. It can support completely custom things. It can support RPC calls as well. Whereas JSON API is focused on entities. So REST API is a thing that you can use for non-entity things as well. And it's highly configurable. So you can tweak every little detail about the core REST API. You can change the paths that you're interacting with. You can change which methods are allowed. You can change which authentication mechanisms are allowed to be used, and so on. Whereas JSON API, because it is so much more opinionated, it is simpler to use. There's better tooling available. There's less bike shedding because it is a spec that we need to follow. It also comes with something crucial that the core REST module does not, which is support for collections. So for core REST, you can only get a specific node. You can get a specific user, a specific term, and so on. But you can get a list of users, a list of terms, or filter that list of users by only the ones that have a certain role or whatnot. With JSON API, that is something that is a key capability that is built in. So you can easily get a list of all users that have this role and perhaps have created some content. You can create those kinds of queries and easily get that data. With core REST, you would have to create a custom view to be able to achieve that. The downside of JSON API is that it's not configurable. So it is both an upside and a downside. There's less tweaking you can do, but it also means it's far less worrisome to set up. Basically, it exposes all entities as long as you have the permissions to access them. Very simple. It just respects the entity access system. If we move to GraphQL, GraphQL, the very short sales pitch would be that it's superb for UI components that fetch only the data, that need to fetch only the data that they actually need to render that UI component. It is very similar to JSON API in terms of capabilities. It is not RESTful. That is a key difference. But for now, we're focusing on JSON API because it has far more momentum. But GraphQL is definitely picking up speed as well. And in terms of documentation, right now, starting with REST is probably somewhat painful at times because documentation is outdated. There's no automatically generated documentation for the specific data model that you have. So for example, you have an article content type and it has a set of fields. You have to kind of know your way around the Drupal field UI or introspect the responses you get. There's no real proper description about what each field is about and how you can modify it and so on. So having documentation with interactive examples to show how to do those things would be very valuable. So that's what's been going on. Roadmap in terms of what's next and what we are currently working on. So these are the people who are most active in the API First initiative. So myself, I'm the initiative coordinator, or initiative coordinator. Matteo, he's our ipso. He's also a coordinator, but he focuses especially on JSON API. I focus on the broader scheme of things. So Matteo is also the person to talk to for OAuth 2. Daniel Wehner, who probably most of you will know by name as well. He helps out with REST, serialization, and JSON API. Ted Bowman, a colleague of mine in the office of the CTO. He coordinates the Open API aspect, so the documentation that I was talking about, but also helps out with REST and serialization. And then Damien Kloip on Drupal.org. He's the maintainer of the serialization module, and also helping out with REST a lot. One perhaps small detail, JSON API builds upon the serialization module in Drupal core, and REST does as well. So fixes that go towards the REST module often happen in the serialization module, which then helps both becoming better, more stable, and so on. So in terms of what are we going to do in the next few months, it's very simple, really. Mature core REST, mature JSON API, and prepare it for core inclusion. And GraphQL, the goal is not yet to really mature it further because we first need to have a stable contrib release. In terms of users, core REST has, we don't know the exact numbers because it's counted as Drupal core usage. But if we look at the REST UI contrib module, which makes it easier to configure it, then we know that more than 6,000 sites are using REST at least. JSON API is above 3,000 and GraphQL is currently at about 50. So GraphQL definitely needs to get some growth going in order to prove itself. Current focus are these four again. So making REST API best in class. What is concretely missing there? Translation support. So if you are doing entity translations, that is something you cannot really get at today. Modifying configuration entities via REST. That's a very big thing that we're getting very close to being able to support. File uploads. Media initiative is also something that is very important and happening, but currently there is no way to upload a file into Drupal except via a form. Of course, you don't want to use a form when using a REST API. So being able to do that, and files of any size, not just a size that fit within the PHP memory limit and so on, it's not super easy to solve, but we're very close there as well. These things have all been in progress for many months. And much of this is really blocked on things elsewhere in Drupal. So the entity field API, the type data API, config entity API, they were built and they work and they are tested, but they haven't always necessarily been taking into account what is necessary, what infrastructure is necessary in order to be able to interact with them via HTTP APIs, because you often need more metadata, more strict validation and so on in order to be able to support that safely. So JSON API, what's missing there is all of the above, because if it's not working in core REST because the capabilities are not there in the underlying systems, then JSON API can't support them either. But what JSON API is missing especially is more test coverage. REST is far ahead there in that regard. GraphQL, only 50 sites using it right now, so we need more sites to use it and to stabilize it. And documentation-wise, 6 months ago, it wasn't clear yet how we would be able to implement that, because there were 4 different modules, each trying to do their own thing. And so now we are converging on a single one, Open API. Consensus has been built, and so now that can move forward a lot faster. After this, because this is a lot of work, many months of work in order to get it all to completion. But if somebody is interested in more long-term things, and it depends on how fast we can go, and so also on contributions, how far we can get in a time frame. UUID and revision support, as I mentioned, that's very important for workflows, and this is something that in Drupal 7 or 8 contrib, I forget, is called relaxed web services. So working on that and bringing those capabilities into Drupal core. OAuth 2, that's somewhat being worked on, but could become a more important focus after Json API becomes more stable and REST. CouchDB support, that's not being worked on at all right now. So these could be interesting next steps after we finish off these areas of focus. And yes, so we can't look at all the things at all times. So everybody is missing some things. There's so many aspects to making all of these things work correctly in all situations with every bit of potential configuration and override and so on. So we would love help, and Acquia is hiring in the office of the CTO. So if working on these tricky problems and helping API first Drupal become a reality, fact, and not just an ambition, come talk to me after this talk at any time during the day. And yeah, we're looking for more people to make this all go faster, basically. The ecosystem around API first. There is some tooling that you can use to make things easier when interacting with Drupal's HTTP APIs. So there is the Waterwheel.js library, which takes away lots of tricky things about certain request headers, URL query strings, authentication, and so on. It also exists for Swift, and I believe in other languages as well. Distributions. This was perhaps overwhelming for those who haven't been playing with API first Drupal yet. So in order to make it easier to get started on what is the current recommended approach of how to bring all these things together in a cohesive, productive way, there are two distributions that have appeared in the last few months. Contenta. Contenta is really focused on boosting the productivity for decoupled Drupalists. So if you are a Drupalist and you're looking to do decoupled Drupal, Contenta keeps those Drupalisms, so everything is familiar, but it provides demo content that is extensive, plus example apps to consume and present that demo content. So it's a great way for you to get started and familiarize yourself with what is possible, how it should be done, how it can be done. Reservoir, on the other hand, it's really focused on non-Drupalists. So it's trying to appeal to an audience that doesn't know Drupal or thinks Drupal has too many Drupalisms, perhaps. So it focuses on simplicity, first and foremost. You only have to know 7 concepts, and you're good to go. So if you're not a Drupalist, that's the one to go. Perhaps if you are a Drupalist and you're looking for some simplicity, you're missing simplicity, then you can also take a look at Reservoir, of course. And they're not really competing. They have a different focus. Both use JSON API and Open API. There is a lot of cross-pollination between both, so it's open source at work. Outstanding challenges, things that we haven't really tackled or perhaps don't even know how to tackle. Things like image styles for responsive images. Image styles are easy enough, but how to make it work in a productive way when there are many different clients and they each have different expectations of what image styles should look like, and so on. Improving DX. In terms of removing some Drupalisms perhaps through aliasing of fields, so removing that field underscore prefix, which is really annoying if you get JSON responses or need to process those. Entity validation error responses they exist and they work and they are tested, but they could probably be made better in the sense that they could be more easily consumed. There's no dogfooding currently, so we have REST APIs, but nothing in Drupal core is actually exercising those. It would be interesting, perhaps wonderful, if we had great UIs in Drupal core to make to both dogfood our REST APIs, but also elevate the user experience. And then perhaps the scariest of all, API versioning. Nobody in the world has solved this, and in Drupal it's extra tricky because anybody can go into field UI and add fields, remove fields, which means that API responses would change. How the hell to do that for API versioning and communicate that to clients and not break them? Very difficult. If anybody wants to dive into that one, let me know. And so that is a pretty fast-paced, hopefully helpful overview of what's going on, what's been happening, what we are trying to achieve. And so I would like to hear questions, frustrations, successes. Anybody who's used something API first Drupal or tried to use it and wants to ask questions or talk about it or give recommendations to anybody else in the audience.
Yeah, but it's with JSON API, and you already covered that basically. But you have the native serialization in Drupal, which builds and the JSON API builds fun, but it's pretty much impossible to build any form of custom response to use that serialization without going through. As I could find it, or maybe because it's updated and I'm still on a slightly older version. But for example, we built a custom endpoint, which is obviously not a point in JSON API, but the choice was made. So
you built you tried to build a custom endpoint in JSON API. Okay.
And then you get a search result because it was a more complex faceted search, which is native to that endpoint. And then we had to serialize it. And the JSON API spec was in no way flexible enough to even extend one of the classes simply to get it in there.
You mean that the specific implementation of the Drupal module was not flexible enough to do what you wanted? It's not the JSON API spec that you're referring to.
The spec itself.
Yeah.
Because that choice was a long time ago, so choice there. But like the implementation itself, and I noticed in the latest version there was this entity to JSON API schema converter type thing serializer. But even that, well, there was no simple way it seems to get the only serialization part, to which part I wanted.
Yeah, so probably the recommendation would be to model the thing that you're getting or that you want to expose as an entity. So kind of create a fake virtual entity type or something that JSON API would then be able to export easily. Or alternatively, not do it via JSON API, but use a REST resource plugin.
Something similar.
Yeah.
We did a bit, but sort of sucked because it's like includes and everything. Sort of went out of the window.
Right. Yeah. That's a tricky thing. JSON API made a specific decision to keep it simple, but because of that, it makes these things harder. Yeah, that's a very good example. Anybody else? Michael.
I think specifically the dog fooding is a very important part, because one of the things I believe that the first idea when we all brought REST into core, we all believed that's now going to solve all the problems, but nobody actually used it.
Yep.
We launched. We thought we have something good because nobody used it.
Yeah.
And being involved in the GraphQL stuff, like actually having projects that use it, it makes so much more sense while you architect your whole API and stuff that you realize the things you assume really work. So I think it's very important that we start now that we have JSON API and things, that we start on dog fooding. So like writing Twig templates, like using the API or whatever we move.
Yeah, whatever we decide. Yeah, about a year and a half ago, we tried to. So basically, Dries was blogging a lot about progressively decoupled Drupal. So to decouple specific UI bits and make those progressively better through JavaScript. So what we tried to do was improve the commenting experience. So we tried, and we failed horrendously because the REST API was like not supporting it at all. You couldn't patch a comment, you couldn't post a comment, you couldn't get a list of comments on the current node. Like all of that was just not possible without lots of bug fixing, creating a custom view and so on. And so that like having to build the UI in Drupal core on top of these APIs would mean that we would have found these deficiencies a long time ago. So I completely agree.
Is there anything that goes on, or is it still people like talk about it?
Yeah, it's because it's so difficult to get started in a sense. So it would also imply that you would have to have, for this feature to work, you would have to have REST enabled, because JSON API is not part of Drupal core yet. So you would have to use the core REST API, and the core REST API doesn't support collections, for example. So that would still be a limitation. If it's a separate module that could ship with a custom view that does this. So there are possibilities, but there are some hoops to jump through, and generally, well, I think the hoops are manageable, especially with experimental modules nowadays. The tricky thing is perhaps choosing a use case and a JavaScript library to use, and then start actually building, instead of endlessly discussing which use case would be the best fit or which JavaScript library would be.
Say Twig consumes the APIs.
It's another possibility, but then do you want to reuse Twig templates? Because that is hard, because Twig templates so our render API calls Twig templates, which calls render API again, which calls Twig templates again. So that's really hard, but there are some possibilities there. Yeah.
I think it would just make sense that like if we look at Drupal like in a maybe 5 years or so, that we say Drupal itself has no understanding, or the core has no understanding of front-end at all.
Right.
And Twig is just the PHP templating system that you enable, and then you have JavaScript, or maybe you have Swift, or whatever. Like there's different things, and the regular Drupal is like something that ships with Twig enabled, because that's what we believe that most people need. But then Twig should use the same APIs as the JavaScript.
There's definitely challenges to be solved there, but I think for simpler use cases initially, that could, like, there's no way it can't work. Yeah. Anybody else who has thoughts on that? Because that's a big subject area.
Is comments the first thing that will be tried?
I don't know what will be tried. That was just something we tried as a small experiment. Like, that seems like Drupal's commenting experience is perhaps a bit dated, it's fair to say. So it could be more pleasant to use, faster to interact with, and so on. Previews, for example, of your comment while you're typing, that seems very common, very simple, but we don't have it. You have that filter tips thing at the top, at the bottom, that warns you, and all of the web is like, what the hell is this? So that's just an example that seemed simple enough, but it turns out that it wasn't possible a year ago. Now it would be, with some gotchas, but overall it would be working. But I don't know what would be the best. No, perhaps it's something on the admin side, because then it's something that doesn't affect the entire front end of Drupal. Whereas this, if it's a commenting experience, is something that is inside the overall front end experience, and then it would be more difficult to integrate with the rest of the team and so on. So if it's a standalone UI, something like Field UI, or the Views configuration UI, or things like that, standalone complex UIs, and that we all use every day, making those a whole lot better, that I think is perhaps easier.
There's always has been a clash in Drupal between like pretty UIs and accessibility. If you're going to move more to JavaScript, don't we have a problem with accessibility in the end? Yeah.
It's a good question. So the question is, if we move more UIs to JavaScript, aren't we going to have problems with accessibility? So in the past, it used to be the case that as soon as you were using JavaScript, any screen reader wouldn't be able to read the constructed HTML, the HTML constructed by the JavaScript. But it hasn't been true for many years now. So it does require some effort to make sure that everything is legible, and to make sure that like live updates are announced to a screen reader and so on. But it's totally possible. There's no reason why it can't work. So it requires extra attention, because it's not just declarative HTML, but it's definitely possible.
Basically, you use the API.
What's that?
Basically, use the API. The W3.
Yep. The area attributes is what you want to use. Yeah.
And then it just works.
Yep. But you have to be careful to not forget certain things, or get certain landmarks and whatnot right, in order for it to work or be interpreted correctly by the screen reader.
Fonts.
And fonts, as in contrast and so on.
No, I mean, the screen reader has to know there's a font used in a certain way. And if it doesn't, for example, if you cleverly add it in, not using a CSS file, but using some other technique, it can miss it.
Yeah.
And then you get very weird results.
Yep. Yeah, it's almost an art getting accessibility right. Anybody else? Questions, frustrations? Who has tried core REST and wished something was better? Someone up there?
We built maybe an e-commerce with the core REST API and extended the custom resource. Good experience.
It was a good experience. Wonderful. No frustrations. That's even better.
You're always frustrated.
Well, I appreciated that it wasn't too frustrating then. Wonderful. Maybe I've been more frustrated because I need to fix all the small things to make sure it all works correctly and doesn't break. Nobody else who has concerns or questions, or like, if only X were true?
A company we often work with, which mainly does content, is unhappy with what Drupal core REST returns, because they tell me that it's mostly just the JSON dump of what's in the database. They mainly do front end, so they only need the data that they use to build their visual components. And they've switched, or they're using Neo4j now to slice the data in such a way that is better for them to build their components. But now here that GraphQL may be better suited. So has Neo4j been looked at? And do you know how it compares with GraphQL?
Perhaps this is a question for Michael. So the question is Neo4j or J, I think. How does it compare to GraphQL? I think Neo4j is a graph database. Yeah.
That's a bit the confusing part. GraphQL is actually not a graph database query language. It's just a query language that uses graphs or has the idea of graphs.
Yeah.
The problem is Facebook itself has like a graph API, which is not a graph database. So they misuse the word graph a bit.
Yeah.
And GraphQL itself can query graph or databases that are based on graphs, like Neo4j. But GraphQL can basically query any data you want.
Yeah.
So GraphQL is more like an extension onto Neo4j?
No.
It's an access layer. It's a way to get data out of there in a specific format. The graph database, I don't know the details, but a graph database stores a graph, manages the graph. GraphQL, the reason it's called that is indeed, I think, because Facebook had an API in the past, it was called the Graph API, which is referring to the social graph, which is the marketing material that Facebook uses. That's the reason for the name. But really, what is a graph? It's relations between different things. It's kind of like a relational database in that sense, I guess. But it's about following the relations to get at the thing that you want. And that's what GraphQL is about. I want to get the user and all posts of the user that contain, and the tags for that, and then the comments for that, and so on. So follow the graph, follow the relations. That's all it's about. So I think it probably would be a nicer way for your front-end people to access the Neo4j database, although I don't know how it's currently being accessed, but GraphQL definitely has a great developer experience. So it makes querying those things very easy. And apparently there is a layer to connect GraphQL to Neo4j and query it in a generic way.
Yes, but they actually had to extend the GraphQL. So they had to extend the GraphQL language
Yeah.
in order to support all the features.
Yeah, in order to express certain things, probably. Yeah, cool. That's an unexpected question, I have to say. Graph databases, that's been a long time. Cool stuff that you're working on, probably. Yep.
Basically on the other way around, so Drupal consuming an API. I work on the RocketChat API.
Which API?
RocketChat API. So RocketChat is a chat application written in Meteor.
Okay.
And in there I use the Guzzle HTTP.
Yep.
And I noticed there's a client implementation or a more agnostic one in Drupal.
There is a what?
More agnostic type.
HTTP client.
HTTP client. It basically refers to the Guzzle client. But which I thought was nice because we could maybe later on replace it. But I couldn't use it in my module because what I get back, I have to declare what I get back, and I get back a Guzzle client. So that means that my code actually still requires Guzzle.
Okay. Yeah.
I was wondering if anybody else has noticed this, and if this is something that maybe has to reworked.
Okay, so the question is, we've been talking about Drupal producing APIs, so providing data. He has been working on something that consumes another API, so getting data into Drupal. Drupal ships with an HTTP client, so you can easily talk to other APIs. But the Drupal HTTP client, it's literally called the HTTP client service in Drupal. So you can get the service, and then you get something where you can do a GET request, POST request, and whatnot. But the thing is, it's not a generic HTTP client. It's something that is actually just another name. The HTTP client thing is a name for the Guzzle client, which is a PHP library. So the question is, isn't it a problem that they are that it's pretending to be generic? The name indicates that, but then actually it's a specific client. That's an interesting question too. I would say if we are going to, as the Drupal project, build an entire HTTP client abstraction layer, That is a big undertaking. That probably is not really the core business of Drupal, the core strength. So I would say it's just a matter of being practical, as in the name could have been Guzzle, but everybody would be like Guzzle that. And perhaps Guzzle changes its name at some point. So I think it's just a pragmatic label and nothing more. And yeah, ideally we would be able to maybe provide an abstraction, but I think Guzzle, it has been updated since Drupal 8's release, I think, from, what is it, 5 to 6 or 4 to 5, I forget what it is. What's that?
It's now 6.3.
Okay, so to 6 apparently, but it shouldn't have broken backwards compatibility for 90% of use cases, so.
But the thing is, what I would like is to have something like HTTP client and then give it some generic instruction on what I want it to do.
Mm-hmm.
Still be able to do Gauss specific things if I would like, but if I don't have to, then I have some generic way of configuring it and getting back an object that I can run.
I have a great idea. You can contribute this. Yeah, so basically Drupal and open source is really about scratch your itch. This is apparently your itch. So I think it probably is something that is increasingly important as more people start to consume APIs via Drupal as well. But so far it's not been, like, I think something that affects a big portion of the Drupal user base. So,
just use Guzzle.
well, sure. Anybody else, or do we want to go to lunch 5 minutes faster? Does hunger win, or do questions win? Sounds like hunger is winning. Okay, no more questions. If you want to come and ask more questions later, you can find me, and thanks for the great discussion.